is this the biggest crock of shit? Yes, I said that. That 3 days is supposed to be enough to grieve the death of someone that you love.
Right.
This grief, this ocean I live in today, there are not enough days and hours in my lifetime to reconcile the hurt in my heart.
Everybody has a story to tell that makes them extraordinary, and that's what this podcast is all about. Welcome back to Conversations with Caitlin.
Welcome to another episode of Conversations with Caitlin. I am thrilled to be joined by my next guest, Anna Bradley, who is here with me during May, which is Mental Health Awareness Month. We are going to have an incredible discussion today about the effects of mental health, how therapy really is impacting the community at large, and ways that we can cope, for lack of a better term. So without further ado, I am thrilled to introduce Anna. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I am thrilled to have you for a myriad of reasons. We've been knowing each other what it feels like a lifetime, but I think it's been about 8 years, give or take. Some of you will recall my wonderful guest, James Bradley. This is his absolute better half, Anna. We're so happy to have her here. So Anna, I was hoping that you would share a little bit of your origin story, how you became interested in marriage and family therapy, and then kind of your evolution to being a therapist today.
Yeah, so it's kind of a journey of sorts. I initially started school pursuing my bachelor's degree, and I thought I was going to be a doctor. I was like, you know what, I'm going to be a neurosurgeon because, you know, that sounds great and cool on paper, right? And then I got to college. I was majoring in biology, and shortly within that first semester, I was like, this is a no-go. This is not something that I want to do at all. So I pivoted to psychology. Ended up, long story short, got my bachelor's in psychology, graduated, and was like, what do you do with a degree in psychology?
What do you do with this piece of paper that says I'm qualified?
Yeah, and as I quickly learned, you don't do anything with that, not at least within the field. And I mean, there's some caveats to that. But so I just started, you know, kind of getting into the workforce, and then I eventually got a job at a cosmetology school as their like academic advisor of sorts.
Awesome.
And so I was like, you know what? I'll go back and get my master's in academic advising because that's kind of what I'm doing now. That sounds like, you know, I can work in colleges, things like that.
Right.
But then I quickly learned that as I was working with my students, we were talking about their academics, we were talking about their requirements so that way they could get their Cosmo license, but the barriers to them completing that really wasn't about the academics. It was about, hey, you know, I just got into a fight with my mom, or I'm going through a divorce, or I worked specifically with individuals who this is like their second career because I did the night school.
Wow.
So it's a lot of people that were like, you know what, I've always wanted to do this, so they're coming back to it. And I was like, this is bigger than just like your academics. And I'm really limited in how I can help you with that. I've got a piece of paper and it's got all of these great referrals on it.
Right.
And that's really all that I can do. And so I stopped graduate school at that time, and, you know, life was lifing. And then when I just,
as it does.
Right. And then when I decided to go back, I was like, you know what, let me look into counseling. I already have my bachelor's in psychology. It's kind of that natural progression. Started back into that program again, kind of had some like in and outs with it. And then really actually like maybe a year before COVID, 2019, I was like, okay, we're just going to full force. We're just going to lock in and do it. And so
I love it.
Graduated in 2022 with my master's in marriage and family therapy.
Wonderful. And so much to unpack there in the best of way. I say this with so much love and respect for what you do. Isn't that amazing that an academic advisor opportunity pivoted you really into the mental health and well-being of others? And that was amazing. When you were saying that, I was like, wow, who would have thought that these, you know, people of probably all ages are coming in, and it's like, I am hanging on by a thread and trying to complete this program. And, you know, the humanity of it. When I think of mental health, it's just, we are all so profoundly connected in our emotional space.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That's amazing.
And really just seeing, like, with mental health, it reaches so many different areas, right? It's not just, oh, well, you go to therapy, or, you know, this person has this mental health diagnosis. It really is just about, like, life stressors in general, and how are we coping with them and how are we handling them.
Well, and you graduating in 2022, so we're post-COVID. It's a completely different world at this point.
Yeah.
The isolation has never been higher. The tragedy has never been higher. I feel like the cortisol levels the world has been carrying. I'll speak for myself. Mine are high. It's such an unbelievable, unprecedented time in the world, at least for those of us, in our middle age, seeing the amount of stress on people. So talk to me about that a little bit. I imagine that when you were in your program and you're doing your hours and you're really getting to work with clients, I mean, what was that like? What were you seeing, and how has that impacted the way that you now approach therapy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started, we call it a practicum. I started my practicum really like right after like everything kind of like was like everybody's like, oh, you're staying inside, right? All this isolation is coming up. And so one, learning how to do therapy in that setting is different, right? Because even I think my professors, like, it's not that telehealth, wasn't a thing, but it wasn't like your main source of therapy, right? You go into the therapist's office, like that would be your typical way to access care. Right. And so even that normally during my program, you would go, because I went to an online graduate school, you would go for like a week in person and have this like conference as part of your training, and we didn't have that anymore. And so now we're doing that online. And so there were some nuances that came up there. You're training me on like also to pay attention to like body language cues, right? And that's not available anymore because I'm seeing you from like here. And so torso, forehead to like right below your bust, like wild. Yeah, so I'm doing my practicum now telehealth in that manner, and all of the things that they're like, hey, look out for this or look out for that. I'm like, I don't get that. Like I don't get to see any of that. But also I'm like talking to people and they're like parked in their car, which is fine, right? As long as you're not driving, don't drive and talk to your therapist. But so you get a different insight into someone's life, right? Because you're not in like my office. Now you're in your home. And so maybe you have, like a 2-year-old right now that's running around and that like your partner is trying to keep out while you have like your private time. Or now like you're in your room and you're in your safe space. And so maybe you feel a little bit more comfortable talking to the therapist. And so I think for me, at this point, that's the only way that I've done it. But just learning from my professors at the time of seeing like, this is really a big shift. And also, how are we dealing with that self-isolation, right? It was a lot of like fear around information in the news. And so managing that, or helping my clients manage that, while also managing it for myself, because I'm like, this is my first time going through it too. And so a lot of that kind of balance.
And I think that's so profound, right? The shift in the way that we engage with each other in everyday life, in a clinical setting, it changes the way we reach each other. It humanizes each other to ourselves, right? I mean, all of those hilarious videos on Zoom during COVID when like the man's on a major business call and the baby in its diaper is just going by in its little carrier. It's like, this is real life, guys. This is what it is. And I think there's something just so amazing about that. But I imagine too, as a therapist, what has been kind of that mental toll in your perspective on therapists making this massive pivot to the telehealth kind of only model there for a while? And what is that like to then be also, I would assume, doing that in your home or in your personal space? Like, how do you draw the line and how do you turn the work off? And I say that so loosely because and cautiously because I'm like, I don't think you ever turn it off. But what has that been like in your experience?
I think for me, it's a lot of separating. Like I have like a designated workspace, right? And so it's like work happens in here. When I leave, it's kind of that like metaphorical like drive home. I never thought that I would miss sitting in traffic until I only worked from home. And I was like, oh, that was kind of nice to have like 30, 45 minutes where I'm just like, jamming out and on my way home. And so it's creating some of those boundaries for yourself that aren't necessarily concrete, right? Because even during the day, right, I can finish a session and then be like, okay, well, it's lunchtime. I'm going to go into my kitchen and maybe I'm watching some TV and then I've got it, do my notes. Then I'm back into another session, right? And so it's finding ways to focus on self-care in a different way because the environment is a bit different. And I think for me personally, it's been a journey of really focusing on how do I get out of the house and be more intentional about it, because I'm very much a homebody. I love to stay home.
You're like, my home is my place. Like, I love it here, which is beautiful.
Yeah. And so finding those ways, and even talking to my clients about being very intentional about doing things for you and drawing those clear boundaries around, okay, I'm going to hold on to this and then I'm going to let this go. And I think exactly to your point, it's not that I don't think about my clients outside of, you know, our sessions, but it's managing that energy of, you know, I'm one small part of their life and I wish the best for all of them.
Of course.
But there's only so much that is within my control, just in general around that. And so when I'm with them, right, it's 100% on you. And then maybe outside of that session, you know, they pop up every now and then like, oh, I hope they're doing well. I hope, you know, that worked out for them, or they're working through that well, and I'll see them, you know, next time.
Yeah, and that's healthy, right? Having boundaries. I think some of these cliche things that have really become like our reality the last couple of years, right? The buzzwords. Yes, you nailed it. But I think, you know, there's something to really be said about that, right? The protecting your peace. Like, I am very heavily fixated on that idea, especially in 2025, just with things that are going on personally and professionally. Yeah. But I love what you said, because you know, you are a part of their life, and yet you are kind of this outside looking in and kind of just seeing it as a neutral party, right? Which I think is one of the major pros to therapy, right? You're not burdening. Sometimes it does feel burdensome, right, to talk to family and friends, and it's also just wanting that neutral, you know, outside perspective. Like, am I nuts? Which, by the way, I say that to myself at least once a week. I'm like, am I nuts? We're all a little nuts, right?
Yeah.
So you kind of touched on this, but I want to dig in a little bit more. You know, therapy, counseling, mental health support. You know, we live in a world where so many diseases and ailments have, you know, cures and solutions and ways to improve quality of life. But yet we live in a world in the most advanced time in our history that we still are almost like stigmatizing and demonizing mental health and not really seeing it for the genuine disease and ailment that it is. Yeah. And so my question to you is, how does your work with therapy and counseling impact the world, you know, because you are supporting the mental health of others? Like, what is your purview on that? Because I feel like we don't talk about that enough.
Right. Well, I think, first of all, it's viewing mental health as part of your overall health and wellness, right? I think exactly like you said, right? We think, okay, well, if I broke my arm, or even if, like, I have diabetes, or if I have a cold, right? It's like, okay, yeah, you're sick, right?
Right.
It's something that you can see, or even if you can't fully see, there's a name for it. And not that obviously we don't have names for mental health disorders, but it's this like invisible thing that you can't see, right? And so even if you think of like taking like a day off of work, and it's, well, you have to be like sick, like with a cold, or like there's something, right?
On death's door constitutes a day off. I just need to say that. I am totally like Anna. We are totally that generation. It's like, unless you are absolutely dying, right? Remember when you were in school too? It was like, unless you're super sick, right? Our parents were working. It's like, where are you going to go? Right. But no, you're so right. You're so right.
Yeah, and so if you need a mental health day, right, it's not taken as that, right? They're like, well, what's wrong with you?
Or it's selfish, my favorite and least favorite word of all time.
So I love the word selfish. And I'll tell you why. And because I talk to my clients about this all the time. It gets such a bad rap, right?
Yes.
But really the idea of being selfish is taking care of yourself. And if you are already focused on having a positive intent and being kind to others, then you're not harming anyone by doing that. Now, if you are, then that's a different thing, right? But otherwise, it's really putting yourself first. And that's not a bad thing to do, but we do demonize that. Totally. And so to go to your question, right, when you think of on a global scale of that, and maybe even just culturally, our mental health affects our global society so much because it's how we interact with each other. So even as a marriage and family therapist, we view things very systemically. So I'm looking at the system, right? Like your family system. How is everything connected? If you're talking to me about, feeling anxious, okay, well, is there a history of anxiety in your family, right? How did your mom respond to stress? How did your dad respond to stress? What happened when they got nervous, right? What did you learn from that? And so on a global scale, it's the same thing, right? How is this affecting the larger community and our ability to relate to each other, interact with each other?
Right.
Talking about work, right? How productive are you at work if you're so burnt out, right?
Right.
And so all of these things, if we're not focused on that part of our wellness, it has these ripple effects that really just harm overall because no one's really operating at their best because our society maybe isn't set up that way.
Well, and we burnout culture, right? Like we're the millennials of
We're
that.
the
I feel like we're the
hustle
tail
generation,
end of that. Like this new generation, I'm obsessed with them on so many levels. In the fact that they see it's like work is just so I can pay my bills. Like I have some people on my team, under 30. No offense to all of you, you're little cute babies to us, the next gen.
Right.
But no, you're so right, and I think. One of my deep reflections since losing my mom has been, and she always said this to me from a very young age. I think I was 15 or 16 when she started, kind of instilling this in me. When you are your best, when you are rested, when you are happy, when you've had whatever outlet that is, working out, going to yoga. I know you're a big yoga girl.
Yeah.
Eating a nice healthy meal, spending time sleeping.
Yeah.
We demonize rest, right? And it's again, I say we. That's my purview on the world and the way that I've also felt that I've been impacted by society's view on rest.
Right.
But you're so right. And don't you wonder, if people were mentally healthier, were mentally stronger, were mentally rested, what would the world be like?
Right.
I genuinely wonder, because when I am operating at my highest good, I feel like this is a very yoga-esque thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I am in better service to the world and to others.
Right.
Women, I have so many women in my life right now that are moms. They're young moms, and they are, they're shooketh by motherhood, and I'm shooketh just watching them do it. I'm exhausted, and I have not even, done one day of this. But that idea that we need to give people spaces and places to have an outlet. I can't think of any other better word right now, but really to have a moment of release, of peace, of rest, that is so valuable. And I love what you said about workplace and productivity. I am at my best when I have rested and I've had time away and I've done things that are fun and I've turned my super hyper-focused brain off, and it's so wild. And I just went on a tangent, Anna. Do you see where my brain is right now? So kind of digging in a little bit more on this. So with the state of mental health, and I think that could mean so many things to so many people. I would love to hear from you. What in your purview, with your practice, with the clients you're seeing, what are you seeing as some of the greatest barriers to actually improving mental health? And what do you foresee is kind of like the trend in the future here? Do we see people leaning more into the therapy and really getting that help and taking that selfish but not selfish time to focus on self? Like, what is that looking like in your purview?
Yeah, I think sometimes barriers can be just their family system, right? And when I say family system, I think what's important to note with that too is there's also cultural nuances to that, right?
Right.
So if I'm talking to my client about setting boundaries and they're like, yeah, my mom's like, that's not happening, right? How do we manage around that, right? Because that may look a little bit different. It may not look like, this textbook, like this is how you set a boundary. Maybe that this looks like focusing on, okay, I'm being a little bit more flexible. Yeah, mom wants me to, go to this thing, with the family, and I'm not going to that. But, I'm practicing maybe more assertive communication around that. And so I'm going to go to dinner with her just one-on-one, right? But being very mindful of what does that look like within the system. And so identifying what are their barriers, right? So if I keep talking to you about, hey, every time that you feel anxious, I want you to stop and to do your breathing exercise, right? And what maybe you haven't told me in that because I didn't ask you about a barrier as well. I'm in the midst of hyperventilating, right? And so
I'm having a total mentee bee. That's one of my favorite things from this younger generation. It's a mentee bee. It is a mentee bee.
Right, yeah. And so I'm in the middle of that. Okay, well, we need to first talk about how are you connected to your body, right? Do you even notice what your regular breath pattern feels like, right? When we talk about there's breath mapping, right? Where I'm not going to change my breath. I'm just going to tune into how do I actually breathe? breathe? Am I holding my breath most of the time throughout the day and I didn't even realize it, right? I know, like for you with theater and things like that, right? You're focused on your breath control, right?
You sometimes to almost like a terrifying fault, right? Like I will lean into what you just said. I am totally a breath holder.
Okay.
In fact, I did not recognize this until someone very close to me was like, they traveled with me and they're like, do you know that you sleep like the dead? Like you literally don't make any noise. And every time I listen to you and watch you talk, it feels like you are going as far as you can in the breath before giving yourself a moment. And you're right. I mean, theater, you want to talk about self-awareness.
Right.
You get to see yourself sometimes, right, where they film or they're doing things and it's like, oh, that's what I sound like. You know, take a deeper breath, take a moment. I love it.
Right. Pause. I'm even myself, right? I'm kind of like a fast talker. And so I'm like, oh, but so identifying that, right? If it's not just about like you show up to therapy and I'm like, here's all of the things that you need to do to like fix you, right? First of all, you're not broken, right? You're not something that is like needs to be repaired.
You're a person, right? Not a robot, not a piece of an outlet or something like that.
Right. And so it's identifying, working with the client. I work very collaboratively. And so it's working with them of what are your barriers, right? Because I see you, you know, for 50 minutes to an hour at most once a week. You've got a lot of life outside of this room. And so I'm not there with you. And so it's really like, I always tell my clients, you're the expert on your life. And I'm just coming in at this point in your life to assist you with the knowledge that I have, but we're working together because you've got knowledge about what this looks like for you. This doesn't look like a textbook of, okay, they said do this and this is going to happen, right? And so it's, and that maybe that's a bit long-winded of just saying, identifying with them, like what are those barriers? And then when we think about just overall with mental health, and you mentioned the younger generation, they're great with therapy, right? They're like, it's cool to go to therapy. My therapist is dope. Like they're all about it. And I think that's one thing that really excites me about this younger generation is it's not a stigma, right? I think you and I were in that kind of in between where it's like at this stage in our life, it's like, yeah, like most people, you've got a therapist or it's acceptable.
Right.
But growing up, at least, you know, even my parents' generation, it's, well, you only go do that if there's something wrong with you.
Right. So Anna, I love what you were saying about root cause. I really, like, my heart was like, yes, when you said that. You know, I think one of the things that I've come to realize in my grief journey with losing my mom, losing a lot of important people to me, actually, in a short period of time, is that there are so many things that I used to think were like the law of the land when it comes to mental health and like mental toughness. Right. That's a big word that resonates with me, right? Like, don't be a baby about it and don't cry about it. And I feel like, you know, our generation, we really were raised by people who were then raised by people, you know, Depression era babies, our grandparents, our great grandparents, who were taught do not emote, especially men. I feel that piece of it really deeply, but you know, not to show your emotion, not to let emotion out. And I think that there's something wildly important about the shift we've seen with young people today. Their acceptance. You said they're like, therapy's dope, I'm going over here. You know, like I think that is really something that's a tremendous shift culturally. And maybe COVID and kind of this last 5 years really has lent itself to kind of opening the door, if you will, destigmatizing, making it more socially acceptable. But I love what you said about the familial piece, because there is something to be said about unlearning. And I hate these buzzwords, people. I hate it. Most controversial thing I'm going to say today. But there's really something to it, you know, especially as women. I look at my mom, you know, when you lose someone that was really that iconic kind of North Star in your life, you start unpacking and thinking back on all the years, right? Like my mom was came from very humble beginnings, had a very rough childhood, right? And I look at the scope of her life, right? I had her in my life for 35 years. And the testament of who she was, right? Like the Davette Shea that people know. She's incredible. And she is, by the way, again, the icon of my days. But I think back to so many moments in her life as a young child, as a young woman, and then as her caregiver in the later stages of her illness. And I realize she carried around so much. And I think to myself, one of the ways I'm trying to navigate my grief journey, and I'm going to let you put me on blast here in a minute with this, is honoring that I am trying to do the most, as the kids say. I am trying to hold it in, and I am trying to stay strong when actually the reality and the anecdote to my problem, the solution is to let it out, is to have the vulnerability, is to cry my eyes out if that's how I'm feeling, right?
Yeah.
And to also understand that the greatest testament to the people that we love when we lose them is to live. And part of living and the human experience is feeling.
Yeah.
And when we become so numb to our own feelings, to the feelings of others, to tragedy, I mean, look, the numbness in this world is outrageous to me.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's really something to be said about that. And so I want to thank you, first of all, for saying that, because you just see, girl, you took me on a diatribe. I went down the rabbit hole with this a little bit. So I want to ask you, because you are one of the experts in my life and someone I so admire and respect. What are you seeing when it comes to grief? Like, where is the coping? Am I an outlier, like over here, you know, having my mentee bees every other week? Or do you feel like people are really finding kind of that grounding and acceptance with grief?
Grief is hard, right? And you're not alone on an island. I promise you that. When we think about grief, just in general, right? And dealing with loss, it's a shock to your system, right? And that's not something that we really prepare for, right? It's not something that you tend to experience constantly, and at least hopefully not, but maybe sometimes you do, right? Depending on your life and what's going on. And this is actually kind of interesting. In 2022, they added prolonged grief disorder to the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is where we get all of like the disorders and like what their symptoms are and things like that. And so it was added, right? Because what they were starting to see is it's not just, oh, well, you're experiencing depression or experiencing anxiety or this or that, right? Grief in itself has its own like set of like symptoms and things that you're dealing with, right? Or maybe you're not dealing with. Right. And so to your point of, I'm just going to be like, you know what? I learned, put this mask on, and we're just going to keep on going.
100%.
Right? This thing happened, and yeah, it sucks, but I'm just going to keep on going because that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to keep on going.
That's what society tells you, right?
Yeah.
Put the armor on. I'm in a show called Crazy for You right now. We say stiff upper lip, right? Don't cry, don't do the whimpering, don't break, don't be vulnerable.
Yeah.
You're so right.
Yeah. And it's, right, even if you think about work, and obviously there's a businesses have to run, right? They give you, 3-4 days of bereavement, right? Go do that and then come back, right?
And that's going to solve the sorrow in your soul that's affecting your physical and your mental health. Right. I will tell you this. I worked for an interesting company during the time that I lost my mom. And that's all I'm going to say about them. But to the bereavement conversation, my grandfather, my dad's dad passed away peacefully in his sleep in April of 2021, almost 2 months before my mom passed away. And do you know, my mom passed away on June 12th. It was a Saturday. I'll never forget it. It was 8:30 in the morning. It was a beautiful day. Of course it was. And do you know that I used those 3 bereavement days, I love that you brought this up, to go bury my grandfather, come back, and immediately jump into work.
Yeah.
And, fortunately for my family, we delayed my mother's celebration of life to October. Right. And we did that with intention, right? We were exhausted. We were in the heat of the summer in Southern Nevada. We had friends coming from all over the world to honor her and celebrate her. But I just remember thinking exactly what you just said. Is this the biggest crock of shit? Yes, I said that. That 3 days is supposed to be enough to grieve the death of someone that you love.
Right.
This grief, this ocean I live in today, there are not enough days and hours in my lifetime to reconcile the hurt in my heart.
Right, yeah.
And where do we come up with this, Anna? I mean, truly. I mean, I'm sure as mental health professionals, you're thinking about this every day.
Right.
You're like, how many days? So what is the grief cycle? Is it 10 days? Is it 12 days? Is it 3 hours?
Yeah.
I mean, and what does that look like with your clientele?
Yeah.
I mean, I have still not grieved my mother's death. I've been really open about that in recent months, and I don't know what the answer is. I want an answer.
You want an answer?
I want a solution, right?
I want a solution.
Again, to your point,
Yeah.
like keep it stoic and keep it smiling and keep it moving and keep it pushing.
Yeah, I think the main thing to be aware of with grief, and even when we talk about the stages of grief, right, is it's not a checklist. Right? We don't do this, we don't go from denial to anger to bargaining to depression to acceptance, right? We don't just check it off like a checklist and be like, oh, I got to acceptance, I'm done, right? Because it doesn't flow that way. You could not get to any of the stage or each stage. It's very cyclical, right? You could be in anger and then you could go to depression, then you go right back to anger, right? It's not something that has like a linear path, and there isn't necessarily a solution where it's like, here, Caitlin, here is a magic pill or here is a magic coping skill, and then you are going to be cured of your grief, right?
Literally, you're going to feel great the next day. Don't I wish that you had that though, girl? I really do.
That magic secret, when really grief is a lifelong process, right? And it's kind of, you said like an ocean, right? Of this idea that it is like a wave, right? Sometimes the wave is really small, and maybe we were driving down the road and we saw something and it reminded you of your mom, right?
Oh, every day.
Yeah, and maybe in those moments, right, it's smaller, and it's a way that we can kind of celebrate her in those moments, right?
Right.
And then there are days maybe where like you're sitting in your room and you're like just sobbing. You're like, where did this come from? And then you start thinking about her, right? And that is just another wave, right? This is a bigger wave that's coming up. And when we think about the coping through it, it's really this idea of distress tolerance in a way, right? Acknowledging that distress is going to come, right? These waves are going to come. We're not trying to stop the wave. We're trying to sit through the wave. And that builds up really that strength, right? Because if I push it down, when the small wave comes, I'm like, no, don't think about that. You've got to be on, right? You've got work. You've got this. You got to do whatever.
People are counting on you, right? You say to yourself, if I lay in my bed and cry today, I'm not going to get the 25 things done on my list, and I'm going to disappoint everybody. I think disappointment is one of the scariest pieces of grief for me personally.
Disappointing others.
I'm letting my dad down. I'm letting my brother down. I'm letting my job down. I'm letting my friends down. And the reality is, again, I think back to kind of the origin start of this today, is when I don't honor myself, how can I possibly be honoring others and honoring the work that I'm doing?
Right. I'm so worried about trying to manage someone else's disappointment, and they're a person and they can manage their own emotions, that I'm negating and avoiding my own.
It's so many profound things that you're saying, and I think so many things that resonate, the universal, the resonating on sadness, sorrow, and grief. I think, in addition to kind of being in a world that we've been numb to that, right? Like it feels like we're watching a horror or action movie at any given day on television or social media. I think on the flip side, we've developed this kind of like weird resilience to almost like not feeling. And I don't even know if resilience is the right word. It's just you see it, right? And you, in your soul, I think for anybody that has a conscience and really deeply cares about others, you are hurt, right? But we've become so kind of shut down to that hurt that it's almost like it's just one more thing you stuff in, and that empathy. I am a total empath. If somebody's feeling something deeply, I absorb that, right? To a fault almost. And I think the world, like we're on the brink, it feels like, of just that need for outlet. So I want to pivot a little bit because we are in May. We are in Mental Health Awareness Month. What is your advice? What is your feedback to people that maybe are nervous or scared of therapy or desperately looking for kind of, again, the magic pill or the coping mechanism, looking for an outlet to kind of release that during this month? What as a provider are you, sharing with the world about the mental health crisis that we are in? And it is a crisis, right?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, especially when you're seeking out therapy, is this idea kind of goodness of fit, right? That not every therapist is going to be the therapist for you, right? I'm certainly not the therapist for everyone, right? And allowing yourself to ask questions, right? I think it's really important when you are seeking out therapy to like ask questions about, what is your intervention style? What does a session with you maybe look like? Asking your therapist, do they go to therapy, right? Because that's really important in our field too. And so getting a better idea of how does this therapist practice and seeing, does that fit for you, right? Do you want to go in person? Do you want to do telehealth, right? Are you someone that maybe you travel for your job, so you need a therapist that's licensed in Nevada and California, right? So that way you can go back and forth. But really allowing yourself to be a little picky, right? Because you want to be able to have a space where you feel comfortable being vulnerable. And therapy is like that, right? It's like walking into a room, there's this big mirror, right? And there's a stranger there who's like, tell me everything about you. Right?
Bare your soul, and I've never met you.
Right, yeah. And so it's acknowledging that you want to feel comfortable when you're doing that. And so even if you go see a therapist and after the first, couple of sessions, you're like, I don't really think this works for me. Like, it's okay to tell that therapist, hey, I think I'm looking for something else. Right. And checking to see, is it covered by your insurance, right? That's a whole other topic that we could go down, but just acknowledging that, right? Are mental health benefits covered? So that way you can see a provider for that. What is your budget around it?
Money and resources always a challenge, I think, in our world.
Yeah. And so finding really the therapist that fits best for you. I think that it would be my biggest advice to anyone seeking out services, because it really does make a difference. If you don't feel comfortable with the person that you are sharing like your deepest, darkest, everything with, it's really actually going to be a hindrance, right? Because now you're coming into the space and maybe you're like being more performative, right? The mask is staying on.
Totally.
And you're not really going to be able to do any meaningful work.
Dig in there, really deep dive into the dark and stormy places in your soul.
Yeah.
And what would you want people listening to this, watching, to know about therapists? What are some of those myths and things that, we, again, our generation's so guilty of this, like, therapists, this, that. What's some things that you would like our listeners to know about being a therapist?
Yeah, I think this idea that we have it all figured out, right? That, we must not have any mental health issues, right? Because we're the ones that are helping. And that's not the case, right? To be transparent, right? I have my own issues with anxiety, and it's been a journey for me to find what works best for me. Just because I know the skills, it doesn't mean that I always can, put them into practice. And that's really giving myself that grace that just because you have the knowledge, it doesn't mean that you always can use it. But that's why I go to my own therapy, right? And she's that mirror for me of, remember this, or, have you thought about that, right? And so allowing myself to be vulnerable in those spaces, along with that of when you think about therapists, right, when you meet them like out in the wild, right, in person, right, they're not analyzing you, at least I'm not, right? And so keeping that in mind, right, that being a therapist doesn't mean that you're just going around like analyzing people all the time or that you have no issues. You're a human too. And I think that's actually the greatest part about being a therapist is that you can then connect with your client just on this human level of I'm a person too. I'm not bringing my stuff right into, your session by any means, but that once you tap into that as a therapist, you can connect more, right? Because it's really this shared human experience that we're all going through something, but it's how we respond to it, which is really the great part of the healing journey in itself is learning and fine-tuning those things and kind of accepting, right? It's not this checklist, this magic pill that it's solved. Always.
Right. Yeah. It's an evolutionary process that never ends, right? It's like life. We always say at the museum, a lifelong love of learning. That means that till the day you die, you're going to be learning some lessons. Yeah. I love that. And I think, one of the total millennial things in me is like, if I go to therapy, I'm being judged, right? That fear of being judged or not accepted. for the way that we feel, right? And again, I love what you said. It's so beautiful. The human experience is profound, and you know, when people talk about AI and technology taking all of the jobs and all this, I'm like, guys, there's something to be said. Yes, technology has its pros and massive cons too.
Yeah.
But nothing will ever replace humanity.
Absolutely.
We are the greatest machines. We are the greatest souls. We are the greatest piece of the world. And I think, you know, we are also each other's greatest teacher.
Yeah.
And I have found in my grief journey, in my mentee bees, if you will, you know, I connect most to others when I am sometimes in that profound sadness or those profound moments of just feeling, right?
Yeah.
The idea that I'm like, I'm just gonna rip this off and let it all out. You know, those moments of that human experience and connecting, it's beautiful and it's gut-wrenching. You know, I don't know many people that delight in seeing people hurt, mentally and physically. It is not fun. It is so scary. And, you know, going through a cancer journey alongside my mom, I know what I know now, right? The first thing on people's minds, because we're human beings, is like, I'm so glad I'm not going through this. What would I do if I had someone in my family sick, right? It holds up a mirror to our mortality also, which is wild and scary, okay? Like, guys, we're all going to die one day. I hope we all know that. But, you know, you don't think about it until you're forced to think about it or you're faced with that. And, you know, that piece of the mental health journey, still trying to wrap your brain around it, right? The rationalization of feelings too is so wild. Yeah. So Anna, I could talk to you literally for 3 hours. I'm like, I am getting a therapy session. Everyone, thank you so much. So I want to go to hope, because hope to me is the solution to about 80 to 90% of the problems we have, right? And then resources being the other 20% of that. Right. So being in your space, working in therapy can be very heavy, but I also feel like could be so rewarding and inspiring. So what inspires you about the work that you do in the mental health space, being a therapist, and what makes you hopeful for the future?
Yeah. Honestly, my clients themselves, to be with someone like at their darkest moments sometimes, right? And then to see them do the work, right? Because sometimes they'll be like, oh, like I couldn't have done this without you, or you did great, you did this, right? And it's like, no, it's really you, right? You're the one doing the things. Right. And so to see them do that and then to be able to celebrate those successes with them and highlight them, even if they think that they're small, right? Really, I think inspires me about this work, because just being able to provide a space where someone can be vulnerable and where they trust me to do that. When you talk about hope and just humanity, it allows that connection that we talked about, and it gives me hope that you have people who they want to connect with others. They want to heal these generational traumas. They want to be the best version of themselves. And kind of tying that in with that younger generation of them wanting to really seek that out and to not repeat some of these patterns, right? Like you said, we're kind of on that cusp generation where we're like, well, this is what we're supposed to do. Yeah. Right. And really challenging that, I think, is really inspiring to see mental health and the stigmatization of it start to be destigmatized. And it makes me really hopeful for the future of mental health and the future generations, in not wanting to just brush it under the rug, of taking it out and being like, yeah, sometimes I feel really sad and I want to learn what to do with that. I don't want to be this robot, right, that doesn't have emotions, that doesn't emote, because I know that as a human being, I get to feel emotions and I get to feel all of them.
I love that. And it's so multifaceted, right? Yeah. This idea that life is black and white, it's the biggest lie we were ever sold, right? Right. The gray area of life is where we live 99% of the time, right? Yeah. And I think there's something so beautiful about that, and the ability to change. You know, I think one of the blessings of being like a middle-aged woman, right? I'm deep in my 30s. I feel so excited about the idea that I can change my mind and the way it was, right? Well, this is the way it is, right? Such an old school mentality, and sometimes that has worked to its advantages. But I also think the ability to see, you know, the world from a 20,000 foot purview and say, listen, at any moment, we as human beings can change our mind. We can change our life.
Yeah.
We can change the way we see and view people and systems that we've lived in. You know, there's something really profound about that. And I think, you know, the invitation that therapy gives people to really explore their mental health and really, and not be afraid of it. I think there's a lot of, I'll speak for myself personally, a lot of fear. I'm afraid of myself. And that is wild, right? But also, I have to live with myself. This is my body, my soul, my temple. I have to make this a house that I want to live in. You know, whether there's a crack in the wall or it's painted perfectly and beautifully, you know, and I think that's something to be said. Well, Anna, I want to thank you because this has been such an inspirational discussion. Am I surprised? Absolutely not. So at the end of every episode, I want my guests to share something about their business, their practice, whatever they're doing with my listeners, because I know that there are going to be so many people that are deeply impacted in such a beautiful way by this discussion. So if you would do me the honor of looking in that camera and giving a 1-minute pitch about what you're up to, your business and mental health, I would absolutely love that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I also host kind of guided meditation circles and psychoeducational workshops. And so you can find that on my Instagram. That's anabout_that_therapy LLC. If you're interested in therapy and want to seek services, whether with myself or another therapist, Psychology Today is a great place to start. You can find me on there, just Anna Bradley at Psychology Today.
Anna, thank you so much for being here with me. As always, everyone, I am so honored that you choose to tune in and listen and watch these profound discussions of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. We would love for you to like, follow, and subscribe as we continue this journey of Conversations with Caitlin. Thank you so much for being with us, and we'll see you next week.
If you enjoyed today's conversation, please like, subscribe, and follow us at Convos with Kate on all social platforms. It would mean the world to me. See you next week.